summer is traditionally a time for adventures. I actually don't know how much that's the case this year. I know that there are probably some of us who are still being cautious, still being slow and intentional about our re-entry into human society. There may be others of us who are truly ready to live it up after a year plus spent in relative isolation. Or, maybe last summer, some of us discovered some new adventures closer to home, some new hiking trails or uncrowded beaches or other COVID-safe getaways, and we're looking forward to revisiting some of those this year. But no matter what adventures your summer may or may not hold this year, we are going to follow two Old Testament prophets, the confusingly named Elijah and Elisha, on some of theirs. Elijah and Elisha are more than just guys who tell the future. They are intricately involved in the complicated, dangerous politics of ancient Israel. You may remember from your Hebrew Bible history that after the death of King Solomon, the nation of Israel split into two kingdoms, a northern one and a southern one. And at this point, the Bible begins telling two parallel histories. You probably skipped over a lot of these parts in Sunday school because it's a lot of kings and even a few queens coming to power and dying and sometimes intermarrying and sometimes going to war with each other. And it is generally just a lot to keep track of. And the Northern Kingdom especially has this Game of Thrones kind of vibe with some very bloody stories of would-be kings fighting it out. Of course, it's worth it to keep in mind that all of these stories are told, at least in the form that we now have them, from a Southern Kingdom perspective. But it's into this Northern Kingdom chaos that the prophet Elijah enters the scene during the reign of a king named Ahab. Ahab is the son of Omri, who killed the previous king Zimri, who killed the previous king Elah. And Ahab is not remembered fondly in the text of the Bible. Ahab married a foreign princess, Jezebel of Sidon. You may know the name Jezebel. And then Ahab began to build altars to Jezebel's god, the Canaanite storm god Baal. We read in 1 Kings 16 that Ahab did evil in the sight of the Lord more than anyone who preceded him. Elijah slips onto the scene relatively quietly. He doesn't get a dramatic call story. There's no burning bush, no word from the Lord. Instead, the first thing that we read about Elijah are his words to Ahab. As the Lord lives, there will be neither dew nor rain until I say so. There's no real explanation here. There's no threat or ultimatum, but we can make an educated guess that this proclamation is related to Ahab's idolatry, and specifically his worship of a god known for making rain. My guess is that Ahab is capable of making this connection too. But of course, as far as he knows, Elijah is no one. He's just a cranky constituent. He's like someone standing all alone with a protest sign in front of the White House, there to make a point, but presumably without much power to actually change things. But ancient Israel is not a democracy, and its kings don't tend to take kindly to cranky constituents. Ahab doesn't even get a chance to respond before the Lord tells Elijah to run away, confirming for us that Elijah is in fact speaking for God here. God tells him to go east and hide in the Wadi Cherith, the wadi being like a brook or a stream. God says that he can drink from the stream and that God has commanded ravens to bring him food. And so Elijah does, and the ravens do. This is Elijah's own manna in the wilderness experience. Maybe you've experienced a time like this, when you've been in trouble and God has provided for you and cared for you in unexpected ways. I think of the time I traveled to Korea for the World Methodist Conference, one of my summer adventures many years ago now. I had just graduated from college, and it was my first time traveling alone, let alone to a completely unfamiliar place. And it was already growing dark as I stepped off the plane at the airport in Incheon and took a bus to Seoul. And when I got off at my stop in Seoul, I realized that I was totally lost. Most of the shops on the street around me were boarded up for the night, and if they had been open, I didn't speak the right language to ask for help anyway. And to make matters worse, it was starting to rain. God did not send birds to help me, but God did send me the one remaining shopkeeper on that street who hadn't gone home yet. I showed her my guidebook and I pointed to where I was supposed to be going. And since I then could not understand anything that she said in response, she ended up walking with me to my hostel, holding her umbrella over my suitcase as we went. That is a story of providence that I am sure was divine. And yet I'm not sure that it completely captures what's happening for Elijah here. I decided to go on my adventure. But Elijah isn't just on an adventure for adventure's sake. Instead, Elijah has taken a giant risk in doing what he believes God needed him to do, no matter that we never even hear God explicitly telling Elijah to confront Ahab in the first place. The story of Elijah and the ravens isn't just about God sustaining us in the wilderness, but about God giving us what we need when God's call for us to do something, some work, is hard and risky, but we agree to do it anyway. So maybe you've never had ravens serve you bread, but maybe somehow you have stepped out in faith before to follow God's call, not sure that you were going to make it, but somehow you did. Maybe it involved a big life change or a significant financial risk. Maybe it involved opening up your life to someone you believed that God put in it when you weren't sure where that was going to lead. Or maybe, like for Elijah, it involved speaking truth to power and all the danger that can come along with that. And then maybe you found that you had enough when you didn't know if you would have enough. And maybe you found that you were safe when you didn't know if you were going to be safe. And maybe you simply found that God gave you strength and people to help along the way. I think of the disciples who left their homes and their fishing nets to follow Jesus, who called them unconditionally, but also told his would-be followers to count the cost before they made any rash decisions. I think of how those disciples went out 2 by 2 to share the gospel, and they weren't even allowed to pack a bag. They didn't know where they were going to sleep that night or what was going to be for dinner, if there would be dinner. It was a risk, but it was a risk that God had called them to, and they had enough. I think of the story of Mother Pollard, which Martin Luther King Jr. told in his speech at the end of the march from Selma to Montgomery in 1964. Mother Pollard was an elder at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, where Reverend King had been the pastor. And when the Montgomery bus boycott began, Mother Pollard began to walk. And she kept walking. And at one point, someone stopped her and asked her, didn't she want to just give up and ride the bus? And she said, I'm going to walk just as long as everybody else walks. I'm going to walk till it's over. And this person said, but aren't your feet tired? And she responded, my feet is tired, but my soul is rested. I imagine that's the way Elijah might have felt there in the Wadi Cherith. Tired, lonely, uncertain about the future, but with a soul that was at rest because he had done what God needed him to do. And I don't mean to promise that these things always work out for the best. Surely there are many stories of people who step out in faith to follow God's call and who do pay the ultimate price. Jesus himself, of course, was one of them. And yet God was faithful then too. Elijah isn't magically protected from all consequences. He's set a drought in motion, and eventually even his own stream dries up. And yet even this is not the end of Elijah's story. The jig is not up. As we'll hear about next week, this is simply the beginning of Elijah's next adventure, another opportunity for God to show God's faithfulness. Because when you step out in faith to do God's work, not much is promised, except that one way or another, through ravens or neighbors, full stomachs or rest for weary souls, or the promise of life undefeated by death, God is bound to show up. Amen.